Tēnā koutou katoa, ko hui hui mai nei. Welcome to everyone who is gathered here today. Kia ora to our panellists who've come from across the globe, but most of them are currently in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and to our guests who are joining us on YouTube. Welcome to this Flash Festival celebrating 10 years of flash fiction in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And thank you for tuning in, and we welcome your comments and your questions. And just a little reminder that everyone who writes in the comments section on YouTube will be in a draw to win books, as we all need motivation to write, extrinsic or intrinsic. And I am certain that this discussion today will provide motivation to write. In this panel, we'll focus on the ways in which our panelists draw on myths and fairy tales in their writing, with a focus on flash fiction. I've asked each of the guests to introduce themselves and their cultural connections through a myth or a fairy story that resonated with them as a young person. And we'll go in alphabetical order. So first of all, I welcome Aparana Taylor, who is in Paikakariki. And Matua Aparana is a storyteller across many forms. He's a renowned poet, a playwright, a novelist, and a short story writer. Welcome, Matua Aparana. You'll need to unmute yourself.
How's that?
That's fantastic. We can hear you.
Sorry about that. Kia ora. Could you just repeat the question for me? I'm sorry.
So, yeah, no, that's fine. So is there a story that you connected with as a young person? What was that myth or that fairy story?
There's no one particular myth or fairy story. I hooked into the whole lot of them, and not just Māori ones. When I was a little boy and I'd only just learned to read, I spent most of my childhood reading all the stories of the Norse gods, the Norse myths, the stories of the indigenous American Indian people, the first people there, all the Roman myths, all the Greek myths, all the Māori myths, every myth of every culture that I can get hold of, I just devoured them. And it's probably about the only thing I enjoyed reading. I think it's the archetypes, these good heroes and these evil ones that makes them so dramatic and have so much truth in them. But if it was a Māori myth, probably I'd go to the story of Maui when he crawled up between the legs of Hinenui Te Po, the goddess of death, to destroy her. Because it's interesting, because Hinenui Te Po is also Hinea Titama, the Dawn Maid. So there's a whole story on how the Dawn Maid, the morning star, becomes Hinenui Te Po. You know, so I'll leave it there because I know we only have a certain amount of time.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you, Aparana. And yes, all those myths, that huge wealth that we have access to. That's fantastic. Next is Iona Winter, who comes to us from Port Chalmers, near Otapoti, Dunedin. And Iona has published 3 hybrid poetry prose collections, A Fine Line, Te Haukaika, and Gaps in the Light. And I understand a 4th collection's on its way. Iona, myths, something from your youth? What attracted you to this concept?
Kia ora. Kind of like Matua, I was exposed to all sorts of things, Māori, Celtic, but the one that jumped out actually in my mind when we were asked to think about what we would present is this lovely book, The Three Robbers.
Oh.
Yeah, so I don't know why it jumped out, it just did, and I think it's the imagery that stayed with me from when I was a young person. I think images are really potent as well as the text. And I grew up with a mother who was a teacher and grandparents who were teachers, so a lot was read to us, probably all of the time. Yeah, but that one jumped out at me, so I brought it along today.
Oh, that's fantastic. Just want to hold that up again.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Viewers on,
it's The Three Robbers by Tommy Angara.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The traditional tale and those fabulous images.
Yeah.
Are there in that picture book. Thank you so much, Iona. Next is Mandira Paitnik, who is an Indian poet and fiction writer. And today Mandira comes to us from Kolkata. She's published internationally and she also teaches flash fiction. So Mandira, a myth or a legend from a fairy story from your youth?
Yeah, hello. Growing up in India, we used to have these picture books of Ramayana and Mahabharata, the small children's books. So as Anna said, picture books really stayed with you. And apart from that, we had Panchtantra, Jatak tales. These are animal personifications and animal tales, which tell you some moral stories. So apart from that, we used to read all these abridged classics, Cinderella and everything. And like Anna said, my mother was also a very good storyteller. She used to make her own stories and putting us into the stories. We were characters and them doing the regular things. So that those stories really stayed with us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mandira. And yes, those early little books that we were given and read, and when Aparana was speaking, I was thinking of the New Zealand school journals, in which I think was where I was first introduced to those Maui stories. Of course, I don't think the Hinetapo Maori story made it into the school journals.
Well, it actually did.
It did?
It started back many years when I was a kid. Because we don't have these Victorian attitudes towards certain things. So we're quite open about it. And Maui crawled up to get the Hinenui to Paul's heart, to stop her heart. He crawled up between their legs. You know, we're born that way. And to reverse death, he had to get up there between their legs, crawl up and get to the heart. But it was too much for society or the Pākehā society at the time. So when they brought it out in some of the school journals, they had Maui crawling into Hinenui to fall between their ear, which is ridiculous, you know. So they couldn't tell the truth.
No, there we go. Censorship right back. Next up, we have Michaela Nyman, who hails from Finland and now lives in New Plymouth in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Michaela writes in both Swedish and English. And Michaela, you've spent time in many different countries and obviously absorbed many of those, been immersed in many of those different cultures. And I understand you spent 4 years in Vanuatu, where you ran workshops with new Vanuatu writers. So you will have a huge wealth to draw on. What resonated with you as a young person?
Well, I have to also say, like Matua Pirana, that the Norse myths, of course, being from Finland and growing up in the Nordic countries, but also Selma Lagerlöf, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, she wrote this wonderful tale about Nils. I think it's called The Wonderful Adventures of Nils in English. In Swedish, it's Nils Holgersson's Underbara Resa. And we have a lot of giants, but also the gnomes and elves and trolls and tiny people, like no bigger than your thumb in our mythologies. And so the gnomes are not the ho-ho-ho man in red. There are gnomes that live in the woods. There are gnomes that live with the farmhouses and farmsteads, and they can be very cantankerous and grumpy farts. And you better not, make them angry with you, or you are going to, it's at your peril. So Nils Holgersson is a 14-year-old boy, and he manages to make this house elf, the old gnome of their homestead, really angry. And to punish him, the gnome turns him into a tiny person, no bigger than the thumb. And he goes traveling with a goose who runs away with the wild geese and goes traveling all over Sweden up to the very far north and through each landscape. And he rides on the goose's back. And this tame goose has to keep up with the wild geese and has to learn the ways of the wild. But also the little Nils then travels across all of Sweden and all the landscapes and learns about them. And this was actually 100 years ago. It was an educational text in the schools already then. And because it was about moral, but it was also about learning the landscapes of Sweden and what is the culture of each part of Sweden. And I just loved that. I loved that. But I was also very conscious that there was like, elves and gnomes and other things around. And my grandfather used to take me out in the woods and show me where the little gnomes lived, where the giant had turned into stone by the water. And he would come alive at night. And then we saw the mists in the valley, and that was the elves that had danced and left their, their shawls and stuff lying around. So it was all very real. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Actually living and being part of all that. Next up, I'd like to introduce Hua Dong, who was born in China and now lives in rural Kerikeri in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Her writing appears regularly in Flash Frontier and was also in Ko Aotearoa, Tātou, We Are New Zealand, the anthology. So Hua, let's hear from you.
Yes. Yeah, I just want to tell one little fairy tale that is quite opposite of a prince falling in love with a poor and beautiful girl. And this is a fisherman. And one day he got a golden conch, and he put it in his, like a water barrel. And then next day when he came back from fishing, he got a table full of food, and his house is all organized, and then his laundry is all cleaned. And then he was, after a while, he pretended to go fishing one day, but he hid, behind the house, and he found this beautiful woman coming out of the water barrel. Actually, is from that golden conch. And then they got married, and then 3 years later, the mother of this lady actually is the goddess of ocean. And so the story is always about the goddess, the daughter, the privileged girl fall in love with a poor but brave and hardworking, handsome man. And there's actually quite a few similar fairy tales that, like Chinese fairy tales. It's quite different from, the Western fairy tale. Mm.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think we're going to find that as we've got such a rich cultural tapestry here to draw on today in this discussion. Next, finally, Vivian and the alphabet. It was so funny when I had a look at the alphabet. So people are probably wondering why I jumped there to Hua, because I have you down as Vera on my original list. So so I stayed there. Vivian, you're the last one up. Thank you so much for waiting. Vivian is also based in Kerikeri, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Vivian is a writer, poet, performer, and percussionist. And I understand that there's an illustrated, co-written, chopped up memoir with a soundtrack that is making its way to us soon. So Vivian, is there a myth or a fairy story that you connected with as a young person?
Yes. Amazingly, Michaela, you just rang a huge bell. The Wonderful Adventures of Niels was one of our fairy tale books that my dad or mum read to us. So that was absolutely brilliant. But the one that I had to hone down, because like so many other people, fairy tales are part of one's childhood, and all the fairy tales form this huge soup. So just like Apirana, I'm sort of trying to narrow them down. But I definitely had a kind of fear or a fascination for the deep, dark forest. And the story for me that goes best with the deep, dark forest is this one, which I happen to have this very new version of, which is called The Musicians of Bremen, because I'm half German. And I think the deep, dark forest is quite a Germanic thing. So the musicians, this drawing is so fantastic. It's a dog, a donkey, a cat, and a rooster. And they're all old and rubbish. And they're just about to be put to death by the farmers who own them for being useless at their real jobs. So they all join up and go on a journey, and they say, I know what, can't do anything else. Let's go and be musicians in Bremen, which is a large and famous town. So they make their way through the forest, and they just happen upon a load of robbers who are eating and drinking and partying and using and destroying all these amazing things they've just stolen from a bunch of poor people in a little cottage. So the animals use a trick by standing on each other's shoulders, and the cat's at the top. Cat's eyes seem to be really high up, and they then bang on the window, and the robbers run away terrified because there seems to be an enormous tall thing outside with glowing eyes. And the 4 animals go in, and then through various devices, hooks, crooks, and funny things, they end up keeping the cottage. They steal back all the things that the robbers have stolen, and they never go to Bremen. They just stay in the house and live happily ever after. And I love that story because when I was a kid, I was very asthmatic, and I always felt like one of those useless animals that couldn't really do anything, that was just sitting around, you know, not helping anybody. So something about that teaming up with other useless animals and finding your place in the outposts of civilization or in the deep, dark forest, making it your friend, really spoke to me.
That's fantastic. Wonderful resource. And I'm not sure if some of these myths and legends and books, they might be being posted up on the YouTube channel chat site, so people can look and find some reading. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question now of all the panelists, and we'll go through in order again to give you time just to expand a little bit, but obviously not too long because all the other sessions have actually run right on time, and I don't want to be the first one to go over. But look and think about, how do myths and fairy tales influence what you write, and how do you weave those myths and fairy tales into your writing? And I really love this little quote from Jorge Luis Borges, where he said, "For in the beginning of literature is myth, and in the end as well." So just keeping that in mind, what are those myths and fairy tales that have influenced you, and how do you weave those through? Aparana, Matua, we'll start with you.
Well, I'd like to read 2 brief poems, take about a minute, and just talk about them for about a minute. So 2 or 3 minutes, is that all right?
That's fabulous, thank you so much.
Okay, well, this poem is called Mountains. Mountains once roamed this land. They fought over woman, exploded, belched fire, ran off into the ocean and shook the earth. Now battle-scarred, wearied and older, they wear the cloak of Hinehukatere in winter, and the sky's finery in summer. They command clouds, weep streams, bleed rivers, and rule with mana. Sometimes they remember old scores, fume, blow fire out their heads, and prepare to fight once more. In Māori myth, in the olden days, the mountains fought. They ran all over the country fighting each other. And we say that there are 2 causes of war, land and woman, and the land to us is a woman, Papatuamiki. So the mountains were fighting over the woman, running around. So they did all sorts of things, everything that was in the poem. So in that poem, I've taken that myth, but it's although it's talking about the myths of our mountains running around and fighting each other, the poem is actually about today. Mountains in various forms, fighting each other and pulling back and fuming and starting up again. It's about the big mountains, spiritual mountains, political parties, whatever you like. So it's about today, or that's based on an old myth, and they prepare to fight once more. It's like Ruapehu. Some start sending smoke up every now and then. And the other one is called Downtown. The day is parched, there is no wind, the clouds are not tipuna, but dark tinged smoggy infusions billowing forth from towers as the spent plumes of Coitus interruptus splattered across the horizon. Fading tracer from a jet zips up the sky. A car park is my marae, McDonald's, Kentucky Fries. Look out, looks up my pie, bills to pay. The pram is my waka. The wind sings, waves crash, the light switch flicks on. In her manawa, she hears the karanga burst through. Mana wahine. She's in their titama at the crossing. The poem's probably about a young woman not too well off living in suburbia. And instead of going back to all our traditional Māori things, her marae is a car park, you know, and Kentucky Fries and Liquor outlets are her life. And her vehicle of getting by is a pram that she's pushing. And all the images before them, most of them are dark and negative images of death. There's no wind, the clouds are not tipuna, but something happens. The light switch flicks on in her, and she hears the call, mana wahine, the power of woman. And so she's not just this ordinary young Māori woman in suburbia with no money and everything else that goes with it. She goes back to her ancestors in their titama, the morning star. That's who she really is, deep inside, when you get rid of all the. See, I find that with us, I don't like the term fairy tales all that much. Myths is better because they contain truth. But in our culture, a lot of us, they're not myths that we read to our kids. They control how we think, how we control our lives, and how we react. We don't think it's just something over there that's a pretty little story. It's part of our culture and religion, and it's there and it's for real. But we still do our ceremonies for these things.
So that's fascinating, Aparana, that you're talking about how the myth is still real today and those mythological characteristics are still in people today. Yes,
well, you see, I'm actually descended from a man called Pungarehu who taught the fairies how to cook their food and did other things. And so I don't really regard it as being a fairy tale. As far as I'm concerned, he's my ancestor. And so it has that weight. My family, we've got fairy blood in us. And if you know my family, you'd believe it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matua. I'm going to go to Hoa now. So we'll leap over to you. So for you, Hoa, what myths and fairy tales influence and how do they weave into your writing? And if you have something to share, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I have to say that I really haven't been thinking, when I write. I'm quite new to writing flash and poetry in English. I just want to share one I recently write, which is inspired by the 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Steve Wallace. So I have one, 13 Ways of Looking at a Hen. Among giant puriri trees, the only wandering thing is a blob of golden hen, molting. Is a hen's vision the same when looking through a wormhole of a scented kawakawa leaf? Subsistence, a man, toast burnt, coffee dark roasted, a hen, seeds, light roasted, oats rolled. A man, a hen are one, a man, a hen, a boy are one, a man, a hen, a boy, a girl are one or not. I don't know which is more charming, a hen's rhythmic strides or her musical mating invitations. A golden hen sits under a golden canopy, a red maple tree, while her eggs taste sweet or spicy. Can a hen pass on her broodiness? I find myself sitting down in bushes, seems for a lifetime, imagining a fleet of my own plump cooing babies. Swallows are migrating to the south. A hen tries her wings. Dark, wet mulch, worms look up, a shadow of a giant approaching, and here it's tiptoeing too. She dreams of going home to see her fragile mother. Her hen goes along, presenting the old lady with a golden egg. She and her hen can see each other from the bedrooms, one with red rose wallpaper, one under a canopy of bloom of rosemary. A gardener and a hen play hide and seek, their favorite pastime. When the hen stops eating, I wish I had fed her nothing but her favorite fresh sunflower seeds. The last one. On Mid-Autumn Festival, a hen is out about, mistaken a full moon for a tiny sun. She staggers towards the hen house at dawn, like she is hypnotized by the air, impregnated by osmanthus golden fragrance. Thank you. I just feel like maybe I feel, because my life in Kerikeri is drastically different from the life before, living in Hong Kong, in New York, and Beijing and Shanghai. So my garden is a little fairyland. And when I see the animals, they are like part of my world, and I see them. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is how I imagined a fairy life, like I'm living in Kerikeri.
That's a fabulous way of looking at your new life. Yes, so a life completely different that would have been a fairy story to you growing up.
Yeah. And I think the language, the fairy tale I used to read, they are always quite simple. Because I grew up in 1970s when China had no TV and not many books are allowed to be published. So we had a tiny little radio. So listening to these fairy tales and myths and stories are really, almost the only entertainment. So, like, to me, that what I learned from these fairy tales and myths is that very simple language, but lots of imagery that really helped, for you to imagine, for children to imagine the story. How could that be?
Yeah, which actually ties in really well with flash fiction, where we are in a condensed form and we've got room to expand. So leaving that space for the reader to imagine large parts of it is part of that flash fiction. Thank you so much. Iona, flash fiction, fairy stories, myths, how do you weave those together?
Well, I'm just riffing off what everyone else is saying, actually, which is kind of cool. Thinking about, growing up with Māori culture and Celtic culture too, for me, and the similarities often between the like Matua, I don't differentiate between, a fairy tale and real life. I mean, we grew up at the foot of the Waitakere Ranges, and so we were out with Patu Paerihi all the time, hanging around in the ngāhere doing our thing. And, that was just part of our growing up, was that little people and giants were part of our world. We didn't, I guess there weren't any judgments around it. That said, we probably didn't talk too much about it at school. So it was certainly something that was at home, more so than it was out in the wider world, I think. Also growing up in the 70s, we listened to the radio a lot. I remember the 1ZB children's radio program, particularly Bad Jelly the Witch. My God, that stayed with me. Spike Milligan, and my son loved it as well. That's what's at 25 years later. He also enjoyed that. So, trying not to ramble on too much. I'm thinking about the Three Robbers book, though, and what I might just read a couple of pages from it, because I really like how the story is set up with these robbers, and they're going around the neighborhood and they're terrorizing everybody and they're stealing all the riches. And then it sort of comes to the middle of it and it says, but one bitter black night, the robbers stopped a carriage that had but one passenger, an orphan named Tiffany. She was on her way to live with a wicked aunt. Tiffany was delighted to meet the robbers. So I love that she wasn't frightened, and then as the story goes on, she challenges them around what they're doing with their loot, and they set up a village for orphans. And, I think what I like about this story, and I think in terms of my writing, when I'm writing flash, I like to leave a lot up to the reader to decide. I'm not into spelling everything out for somebody. So always thinking about, that balance, I think, that is often in any kind of traditional myth or legend or fairy tale. There's always some kind of balance that is either out of balance or it gets righted through the process of the story. That whole sort of thing around morals. I think I grow up with a very strong sense of morally when things weren't okay. And I like that can be drawn out in writing, whilst leaving space for the reader to decide, what part of the kōrero they engage with, really. So I think they really do have a place in Flash. I'll often use a line if I'm trying to do a prompt. I know we're going to talk about that later, but I'll often use a line out of a short myth or legend or fairy tale, sometimes to just get me started on something that might be outside of what I've been writing about. I think we can learn a lot from children's books. Their simplicity. I love their simplicity, but also their depth, you can read so much into it.
Thank you so much. And I think that does sum up a little way with flash fiction, is that simplicity, that shortness, but the depth has to also be there. And we can draw on the myths that we have in common, can be sometimes a little shortcut, that illusion that we can fit in there, that we have some commonality with. And so interesting to hear the common things that are running through. You mentioned the Patapaerehi, the small people, and we've heard about the elves in Finland. And I know I grew up with my mother, who left a little wild patch in the bottom of the garden for the fairies. So these are all things that do run through. And you also mentioned the radio programs, and that was something that really, I certainly remember hearing a lot of those stories on there. So that's a fabulous connection there. Mandira, let's hear from you. How do you weave myths and fairy tales, legends into your writing?
Yeah, I tend to draw the personification of nature and its elements. That is a theme I am really drawn to. Because nature is really abundant here. So it's not difficult to imagine the fluffy white clouds as chariots and black clouds as a gang of robbers and so on. So I use them a lot. And in one of my stories that was published by Flash Frontier in the Thunder issue, I'd like to read that. I personified thunder and clouds as angry Vikings. So it's called Angry Vikings Beating Drums. Daima sees a flash. She wonders if the Vikings will visit for a golden wedding. At nights, encased in patchwork quilts, she dreams of her angry ancestors. Tells us the Vikings are like her husband, always grumbling about something or the other. They are complaining because they are dry, thirsty. Water? We haven't any in miles. So on her directions, we place nuts and roots instead, foraged from the barely forest, on the podium near the temple. Make de pani dere, we circle around, tongues like serpents, feet leaping flames to match the rhythm, while Daima sits by the bony palms that are waving rickety arms to the skies, a begging. Later, we trooped to our straw and mud encampments and drunk on oars, idle. On her anniversary, Daima shouts orders. 2 days of fodder left. Spread them out. We pretend to oblige. She is hallucinating. Our cattle are long gone in the drought. Towards day's end, she cries out. They are here, beating drums, between gleeful shrieks. Raises a hand to quieten us. Her face is contorted, ears strained to hear. Maybe if we stay still long enough, become stones, we'd hear a faint rumbling too. So that was the story. Because drought is a consistent problem here. Lots of times, floods and droughts, they're like, sometimes there are floods some years and there are droughts some years. So I blended that story about angry Vikings because clouds as angry giants or monsters, that was a consistent theme in our fairy tales. So I blended that and used a current theme, and then I wrote this Flash. So I think, as everybody said, that simplicity in fairy tales and recall value, and these are the things that Flash uses a lot and can be used. to write good flash, because they have recall value and they are simple and people relate to it, because everybody has read some of the other fairy tales in their childhood. So that's a very good starting point to write a flash fiction.
Thank you, Manjeri. Yes, and you're right, that connection, being able to make a connection quickly with your reader so that they're drawn in is really important. So thank you. Yes, and that thunder piece, just beautiful. That's just great. And it made me think too about the mountains that Matua Apurana was talking about, storming across, that use of nature, that personification of natural features. Yeah. Michaela, you've got something. How do you weave your fairy tales and myths into your writing?
Yeah, so my current work weaves in our national epos, which is called the Kalevala. And that was actually, it's like these travel stories and legends and myths. Some of them are of thousands of years old, maybe 3,000 years old. But then Christianity came, of course, in the 1300s and thought that all of that superstition and stuff should be thrown out. But in the 1800s, like 1830s, 1850s, Finland was trying to, establish its national unity, having been colonized by the Swedes and the Russians, and off and on and off and on, and it's ongoing. Yeah, we got this Kalevala in 30 songs first, and then in 50 songs, cantos. And that became like the Icelandic Edda, the Kalevala is for us. But when you grow up, you kind of distance yourself from those things and think they are childish and so on. So it actually took me someone like Neil Gaiman and his amazing treatment of fairy tales to realize that there might be some truth to it. And then I grew up with these amazing paintings by Akseli Gallenkallela, who was in the late 1890s. They are in our National Museum in Finland, and they depict Kalevala. But looking at it now as an adult and coming at it with a kind of feminist lens, the treatment of women is awful. So here is, I'm coming at flash fiction from a prose poetry angle. So indulge me, I'll read a couple of stanzas out of a very long poem that is drawing on the Kalevala. It's new work. So it's of coming back to Huai's eggs. There are eggs here too. Of wombs and eggs, a creation story of the Kalevala. 1. In the beginning, there was only a void in which air and wind thrived. The wind toyed with Ilmatar, goddess of the air, filled her womb with 7 eggs. Out of the shells emerged moon, stars, earth, and sun, the gods of magic, music, and smithing. And then a man, fully bearded. Consider for a moment why Ilmatar had to be a virgin when Ilma means air, weather, and wind, while Väinämöinen was born weathered and wise. Ilmatar loved floating in the primal waters, relished fish pooling in her footprints, pressed character and contours into the land. With her body, she made all that is. Consider why Väinämöinen, water god turned man, a shaman, is credited with bringing life to a barren earth when it was Ilmatar who brought him into the world. 3. Väinämöinen sang up the world, Ilmarinen forged the sky, beat colors into heaven. When young Jouhakainen lost the singing contest and faced death by drowning in a swamp, he bought himself freedom with his sister Aino's hand. Mom always saw beauty in Aino's moves. I saw a young woman trying to escape this lusting old man. There she is, a Nyx, a water sprite, a salmon leaping, free, then gone. Next is Ilmarinen's wife, torn to pieces by wolves for distressing a slave. A slave! Skilled at forging, Ilmarinen crafts a new wife out of gold and silver, then discards her, saying she was too distant and cold. And what about Louhi, the priestess who ruled Pohjola, the shadowy far north? Why was she considered a witch when all she wanted was to protect her daughters from those marriage-obsessed invaders? Louhi, the ultimate wicked witch of the north, long before Broadway. Yeah, that's my stuff, current. And so here I'm trying to kind of weave in our traditional history, which is not at all simplistic. It's so complicated, and like, I guess that's why it's hard to even explain in other words. It's almost better to just take snippets and then say, well, you'll have to go and look it up, what they are actually singing about. But basically, these are oral songs that have been passed down orally, and then they were put together in words on paper to kind of forge a national identity of Finns, in the face of colonizers and invaders who were bound to come further down the track again. And I'm kind of ashamed that I actually don't know it by heart, and that it has taken me so long to rediscover and kind of find a joy in it, because it's pretty amazing. And it's my story, it's my roots. I'm not taking anyone else's story. This is actually, there's so much to be found. Yeah.
It's fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing that, and that richness of that oral history that was there, and finally that it's accessible now because it's written. And when you said you can just go look it up, isn't that fabulous? That we can do that now. We can just go look it up and figure it out. Vivian, let's come to you. So what about you? I understand you mentioned to me in one of your emails about fairy tales making writing spicy and resonant, and I'd love you just to build and expand on that.
Yes, I feel like I waste time talking about my writing, but because I'm a psychologist, that was my job before I became a writer. And just what Apirana was saying about, for us, these worlds this is part of our world. I feel exactly the same, but in the Western tradition, I come from this background of going inside your head and then building outwards, and almost making the assumption that everything out there is part of what's inside rather than something separate. So one of the books, this is one of the ones I've put on my list, which is very influential to me, and I find it difficult to recommend because it's so bloody misogynistic in the version that I have, which is from 1976, but it's called Escape Attempts. And the spicy thing that I find in here is that this beautiful little phrase from the chapter inside here called The Inner Theatre of the Mind. Now, I'm an actor as well, so theatre is very central to my thinking. Summoned up fantasies, which I would put myths and legends and stories into, make the present enjoyable or more tolerable by transporting the self to a reality of delight, to a different modality of experience. The sense of having been somewhere else is often so acute that we may refer to them as transformers. So I feel very strongly that myths, fairy tales, whatever you call them, those stories that are out there, that are floating around, that are oral or written, doesn't matter, they actually transform us, and they transform the way we walk our lives, the way we proceed through our lives. And like Michaela, I have to say, I have a very feminist hole through which I view the world, and I did even as a child. So as a child, I was like, yeah, but why do the boys have all the fun? Why does he have to go and kill the dragon? Why is she the horrible one? So another book that's really important to me, also very spicy, is The World's Wife by Carol Ann Duffy. It's a book of poetry. The poems are nearly all short, but they are about Mrs. something, or the female version of something. And does everybody know about Medusa? Medusa is the sort of terrible creature that had to be killed, of course. She had snakes for hair. She had tied a beautiful maiden to a rock. How awful of her. And worst of all, she turned anyone who looked at her to stone because she was so ugly. Imagine such a thing. So this is the start of Carol Ann Duffy's poem. A suspicion, a doubt, a jealousy grew in my mind, which turned the hairs on my head to filthy snakes. as though my thoughts hissed and spat on my scalp. Now, I defy anyone not to be able to get into the mind of this character, this personage, and for it to turn them round into this transformative state where you can then start to imagine, but what if you were Medusa? What if you weren't the hero? What if you were that? So that's what I love about this slender book of poetry, that she has taken all these characters. There are all sorts of, there's the devil's wife, there's Pilate's wife, there's Shakespeare's wife. So, and there's Darwin's wife, who says, well, last time we went to the zoo, I said, hey, that chimpanzee reminds me of you. So, which, that's all. So it's absolutely brilliant. So what I would say are these spicy things, herbs and spices. So I actually was trying to break down what's the difference between fairy tales and myths. But the thing about myths, which I really understand where Aparana is coming from, myths are so big, they're massive, they're epic, they are the universe, they are explaining the world. And in many cases, they're still alive. So please don't like stamp on them and go, oh, that old stuff, because in many cultures, myths are still alive. Whereas I do think that fairy tales are smaller, they're more domestic, they're smaller scale. And they are the stories we have passed along. Lots of them are absolutely ridiculous, stupid, but like my 4 animals going off to Bremen to be musicians, they can tell something lovely and you can pluck something out of them. I don't think they are always, not always, moralistic. That's kind of optional. So with that in mind, the Virago book of fairy tales, I recommend this to anyone. This is old school feminist, Angela Carter, brilliant writer and a writer of fantastic kind of horror books, modern horror novels, I would say, from the 80s and 90s. She has edited this. It's in the language and words of a bunch of really unexpected fairy tales. Lots of them are very familiar fairy tales, but they're told in different ways or in different versions. I'll give you an example of the chapters. So these are the types of things I weave into my work. Chapter 1, brave, bold, and willful. 2, clever women, resourceful girls, and desperate stratagems. 3, sillies, just sillies. 4, good girls and where it gets them. 5, witches, absolutely whole chapter for witches. 6, unhappy families, so many unhappy families, right? And 7, moral tales. So it's just wrapping it up.
So I'm just going to have to stop you there, Vivian, because I realise we've got
10
minutes left. Oh, fantastic. And your list of books, hopefully Michelle will get those up on the YouTube.
They are on the chat at the minute.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll get those
you can see them.
Thank you so much. And it's horrifying to realise that there's only 10 minutes left and I've got a huge list of questions. So I'm just going to open it up a little bit because we've had a question from one of the people on YouTube about the idea of young adult stories, a lot of them that retelling of myths, twisting them, modernising them. And Michaela, you mentioned Neil Gaiman and of course his playing around with his book, particularly The American Gods, where he was drawing on gods. So throwing this open to you, how do you feel about people playing around with stories that belong to certain cultures, or are they free for all? We'll start with you, Matua, because you mentioned that some of these are your ancestors. So how do you feel about it?
I can get quite angry, really. You know, these myths have been around for thousands of years and they contain deep spiritual truth. And from time to time, I find when I've been asked to write for schools and things, and with the push on, let's get more Māori into schools and all that, it becomes more. And I find myself telling our Māori myths and having an editor send them back, say, no, you can't have this. No, you can't do that. No, we can't have that. So they water them down. And when I was a child, I hated just about every book I was given to read because I found them anemic. All the life had been taken out of them. but with the myths, they're still there. And little boys love nothing more than to read about soldiers running off. The more swords and chopping going on, the better. And it's a good thing to have these things. You know, we can build ourselves up and make ourselves into heroes. I'm not too sure about women. The women in a lot of myths are very powerful, actually, you know. And I get angry when they're watered down by the thought police saying, your children can't read this. You know, we can't have this, we can't have that. And an astonishing example for me is this stupid film called Moana, in which my ancestor, because Maui's also one of my ancestors, he's in my genealogy, he's a fat blob. And when you understand what Maui stands for, Maui is actually an erect penis. That's why when he enters the goddess of death through the legs to defeat death, that's what it is. And what happens? The goddess of death wakes up and thinks, you little so-and-so, she gets angry, squashes him to death. So that erect penis goes down, guys, but it comes up again, you see, later. Well, should do anyway. But you see, where was that in this Walt Disney popcorn version of Maui? You know, I didn't see that in there. They've taken my ancestor and turned them into a load of popcorn, American popcorn. And I walked into one of my grandchildren's places one day. Someone had given them the video, whatever it is, of Moana. I flew into such a rage, I smashed it, which probably wasn't such a good thing, but I did. So I think we need to be guardians and keep these things alive, because otherwise we're just telling a load of lies.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you so much for that, because that obviously comes, and that anger that you're talking about comes from your heart, because these are precious taonga, precious to you. So thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on this, the way that fairy tales and myths are being retold, repackaged? Michaela.
So the paintings I mentioned, there is worldwide, in the wake of the Me Too movement, there's of course a re-evaluation of paintings as well going on. So Akseli Gallenkalela's paintings of Kalevala themed work, which are amazing. They are also being questioned, and whether the Aino triptych, which is part of what I read in the poem, whether that should really be hung up and romanticized, because that's what it is, this romantic image of the naked woman who flees the old man sitting in the boat and reaching out to get her. And of course he wanted her sexually and as a wife, and she's trying to flee and commit suicide because she wants to escape him. And so yeah, it's very problematic to kind of retain the old way of reading it. And I think we have to engage in all this work and kind of look at it with fresh eyes and engage with the young people who are seeing other things and not just cling to that romantic version. As I mentioned in my poem, my mom always loved the Aino myth. She retained that romantic view. Oh, that was such a tragic ending. Yeah, but tragic for different reasons. That the old man is kind of, wants her, and just she kills herself because there's no way out. We had a very different reading of it.
So a lot of myth, you're drawing into a point that I've been looking at around the myths really relating a lot to trauma and dealing with this human condition and dealing with traumatic incidents, bringing back family, bringing back connections and so on. So does anyone want to talk to the idea, the concept around trauma that is deep within so many of the myths?
I think they're really important, and I think I worked in the trauma field for 25 years, and so there's something to be said for these very direct ways of naming it, because it's not spoken about enough in any of our worlds. Trauma, even more so, it becomes more squashed down, and or everybody wants to talk about it in one way. So I think for myself, traditional myths legends, fairy tales, whatever words you want to put on it, are really important in terms of a voice that can convey that. And sure, as time goes on, we can unpack that stuff and intellectualize it. But I think they're really good for naming things that children may or may not be able to find words for. And I think that's the biggest problem with trauma, is that it's often wordless. So I like that about these kinds of tales. Yeah, I'll shut up now because we haven't got much time.
No, I am so sad that we don't have much more time, because I think we could keep talking for a long time, and these are really deep and meaningful things. And who knew? Flash fiction, deep and meaningful? Yeah, of course it is. I'm going to have to wrap up now, and I'm going to say thank you, huge thank you to the wonderful panelists. Where else would we have discussed wombs and eggs and penises, mountains and thunderclouds, fairies, elves, patapairihi, robbers, dark forests, and morning stars? What a fabulous treat to speak with all of you. And here we are celebrating flash fiction in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I must say a very special thank you to the National Flash and the Flash Frontier teams, who have done so much work behind the scenes, and to remind everybody there on YouTube to tune in for the rest of the program this afternoon, and then at 6 p.m. this evening New Zealand time, to make sure you're there for the special celebrations and the announcements of the winners. So thank you so much to all of our panelists, and we're going to have to wrap up and say goodbye. So any last quick words? I think we've got 1 minute left on the clock.
Yeah, can I say something? Yes, there's a very famous book from a Chinese writer who got Nobel Prize on literature. He had an idea 50 years ago, but he couldn't put it until he found the incarnation. He just used incarnation as the structure to carry his story. And the story is called Life and Death are Wearing Me Out. And yeah, so lots of myths could be certainly used in a modern literature and become a thread of a story. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So the thread, the weaving together of everything. Yes. Thank you for finishing with that. Yes. Okay, kia ora. Thank you so much, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.